A few years back, for about 6 months, I worked for a Chinese ballet company. I have a video about that if you want to learn more about it. It's not really pertinent to my philosophy, the school project, any of the stuff I focus on now, but it was kind of an interesting episode. The ballet company is run by a religious organization, and there's all sorts of possible intelligence connections and weird stuff going on with that religion, Falun Gong, Falun Dafa. While I was there, though, I made pretty close friends with the sound engineer of my orchestra, who was a Westerner, and he was actually a member of the Wallenberg family, which is the leading banking dynasty in Sweden, which just adds into this enigma of what exactly is going on with Falun Gong. But anyway, he says that his branch of the family had been more or less disinherited. I don't buy that completely, because when they had breaks, he would go off to the Mediterranean to sail around. He loved sailing. And he went to England for school, as many upper-class Swedes tend to do. So he had more of an English accent than a Swedish accent. But in any case, he was a hardworking guy. He was an intelligent guy. He claimed to be a true believer in the religion, but who knows if that's the case. At one point, though, he related a story about a classmate of his who was a Rothschild. I was talking to him about conspiracy theories, and I mentioned how important the Rothschild dynasty was, not really understanding who this guy was. But anyway, he says, oh, I went to school with a Rothschild. And he says how in the morning before school, this kid would be out there with his mom in the car with his nice thick glasses going through every line of the homework. The mom would be reviewing it with him. He was apparently a hyper-focused, diligent pupil, really hardworking guy. And, you know, that does add up with what I've seen of elite behavior in general. These people are very rarely lazy. You can say they're evil for this reason or another, but they work hard to maintain their position. Sure, some people are just born into wealth and they enjoy the wealth, right? They don't work hard to forward their family business or anything like that. But the ones who do maintain control over these institutions established by their ancestors, they're not playing video games. They're not wasting time partying. They're focused. They have a goal. They carry it out. People online like to talk about the so-called elites. I like to talk about the so-called elites. Something that I've noticed for years is that their philosophy is strikingly similar to the philosophy that I've come to. Part of that is they've left breadcrumbs for people to go towards their way of thinking. That has to be admitted. But I think I've been pretty true in my pursuit of knowledge. I think I've tried very hard not to become biased, not to be exposed only to select sources of information. I've tried to go as broad and wide as I can and as deep as I can into the particular fields that I think matter the most, like physics and things like that. Not that I claim to be a physicist, but I try to be objective in my way of looking at the world. And I think many of the elites have very similar metaphysical ideas as the ones that I've come to, which is not surprising, because if you trace those perennialist ideas, they go back to the elites during the Renaissance. They go back to elite families during the late medieval period. They go back to the Knights Templar. They go all the way back with the elites of the Byzantine Empire, the Platonists that survived in the Byzantine Empire, and the elites of the Roman Empire. I mean, this philosophy has always been an elite philosophy, going all the way back to Eleusis. So, I don't think they're lazy. I don't think they're stupid. I think they're highly intelligent. And when they think about global problems, they think extremely rationally about them. One of the core problems that they're aware of is the fact that as technology improves, weapons of mass destruction become more powerful and cheaper, easier to hide, easier for a single actor to exploit. And they listen to people like Nick Bostrom that makes these sorts of arguments. And they're responding to it. Now, the average person doesn't think of that kind of global security threat at all. But the people who are running things think about it, and they're the only people in a position to handle that kind of Dr. Evil scenario. Now, on the other hand, they might become Dr. Evil, and we don't like that. But you and I aren't in a position to save the planet from one of these kinds of threats, or from an asteroid. When it comes to human existence, the people best poised to preserve it in the face of existential threats are the so-called elites. We can call them evil, but they've worked very hard over many generations to get where they are, and they're thinking about the long-term prospects of the species and how best to maintain it. A lot of us don't like the idea of population control, but resource scarcity is a reality, and they are in the process of re-engineering the global economy to preserve resources. I don't think they're being disingenuous when they talk about that sort of thing. Maybe they exaggerate, like the scientific literature on global warming, sprang out of nowhere in the early 90s and then was obviously pushed by elite actors. They use that as a noble lie to accomplish things that they do want to accomplish anyway for environmental reasons. They've done the work to look after the future of the species. Most of us have done nothing. Most of us only think about our own welfare and what we're going to do with our individual lives. Now, part of that is the power that we have, right? We have not even half the power they do, right? We're very weak compared to them in so many ways. So maybe it doesn't fall on us to take responsibility for that sort of thing. But many of us, as a coping mechanism, imagine sometime in the future where we will be able to decide how society is run. We'll be able to draw the maps. We'll be able to make these calls. But we're not thinking about global resource scarcity, global security threats. We're not thinking about the depth of problem solving that the elites occupy themselves with. And they don't do it in a haphazard way. They assemble conferences. They recruit scientists. I mean, they've built up the scientific establishment to be what it is. We may not like it because some aspects of the scientific establishment seem oriented around propaganda, social engineering, medical tyranny, but those coercive, manipulative aspects of the mainstream scientific establishment are being created as tools, necessary tools, to bring about this re-engineering of society in the interest of long-term sustainability and things like that. When you're on the losing side of the deal, you can have resentment that powerful people are changing things in ways that you don't like, but somebody is going to take power. If it wasn't the current elites, it would be whoever was able to occupy that position. Now, if you believe, let's just talk about like Western civilization. If you believe that the conquests of Western civilization were historically normal, and therefore we don't owe anything to the conquered and enslaved peoples that are still living in underprivileged conditions relative to the average Westerner, if you think we don't have any responsibility for those peoples, then why would you think that the elites have any responsibility for you? The same logic applies. That conquest, the pursuit of power, is just normal, right? If you, as a white Western male, don't actually have white guilt, then the average member of the elite doesn't have any guilt either for what they're doing. They're just seeking power. It's just historically normal behavior. So we can have resentment about it, but that doesn't exactly do us any good. Now, obviously, there are conspiracy theories about pedophile rings, all sorts of corruption and seemingly evil stuff that goes on in those circles. But you have to ask yourself, how corrupted would you become if you suddenly were able to have every one of your wishes granted? If you could have any woman you wanted and you lived that way for years, what would happen to your tastes? You can say that you would never be corrupted, but most people assimilate to the culture that they're a part of. So that aspect of culture may in fact develop regularly among elites. But, I mean, what are we ultimately talking about with pedophile rings? How often is it, really young boys, young girls? How often is it 16-year-old girls? And how historically normal is that? How many of your ancestors, your male ancestors, got married to their brides when they were 16? Not to defend the elites altogether in those practices. I'm just saying, if you're going to judge them, you have to ask yourself, would I do any better in their position? Should we have resentment about the position of the elites? Should we complain about them because they're evil? They've done what they had to do. If you believe in karma, they are in that position for a reason. So, I mean, really, the situation is that you are being phased out. That's the direction of the economy. Wealth is being concentrated more and more. This is happening right now. Your children will have inferior prospects to you, and probably as part of a conscious population control mechanism, we're being exposed to chemicals and environmental factors that are reducing our fertility. You're being subjected to that. A lot of the people that I talk to, my age, do not have children, and that's normal. And this is happening right now. You're being phased out. So you can have resentment about that. You can try to change that situation, but feeling superior to the elites because they're bad and you're good is just stupid. I have no reason to suspect that the average viewer of this channel is better than the average elite. Do you have a harder work ethic? Have you accomplished more? Have you benefited others to a greater extent? Or are you just assuming the worst kind of moral corruption in them so that at some level you can feel superior to your masters? That might be the case. Notwithstanding, all of their re-engineering of society is bringing about at the same time, opportunities if you organize intelligently. We have more opportunities for collectivizing than we have in the past. Hypothetically, you have access to millions of people. A grassroots campaign could bring about a new way of life, a fundamentally new way of life, right? Like I said, they're exposing us to chemicals and cultural factors that are lowering our fertility, increasing our suicide rates. Well, we can offer alternative living styles, lifestyles, and cultures. We can produce those things, produce communities that are sustainable, and do so aggressively if enough people are involved. But organizing people is difficult, and it requires humility because you have to organize hierarchically. There's no egalitarian way to organize at scale. With 5 people, you can more or less reach consensus. When it comes to 1,000 people, that's not going to happen. You need hierarchies. And you need hierarchies that are built on more than just individual charisma because, well, that's not how the elites operate. They have their conferences. They operate according to scientific demonstrations. When one of them has a project to put forward, a plan to put forward, they do their research. They get their data. They demonstrate. They don't just claim. They demonstrate to one another. They trust reason. They're methodical. A charismatic leader cannot compete with the way that they have organized things. But we have the information technology to organize at scale, to organize hierarchically in ways that are meritocratic. And smaller organizations do have some advantages over larger institutional players, like the elites, where they have norms that are set in stone that they can't violate. They have policies they can't violate. There's inertia behind them, which just makes sense. They're a large thing. When they move, when they change directions, it's like the Titanic changing directions. They can't always avoid obstacles or respond in a timely way, except to circumstances that they themselves control, which is why so many of the news stories that occupy the mainstream are false flags or they're things that they themselves have engineered. But a smaller, well-organized force could take advantage of the news cycle to a greater extent, could market their alternative lifestyles, alternative cultural products, but not if everyone who feels this way, who wants to set up some alternative, who doesn't want to be smushed by elites forever, not if all of those people are just stuck in their own habits, their own daily grind. That is the main way they're able to suppress revolutionary forces. The kind of people who have a vision that is even tenable are forced to work to support their family. They're forced to spend all of their time doing things that drain their energy away. And it's hard to organize. Individuals get stuck. And to get unstuck, we would have to cooperate at scale. But to do that, you would have to actually talk to each other. You would have to submit to the rationality of someone else who has demonstrated their case more fully than you've demonstrated yours. And when I look at the behavior of people in these spheres, people have their biases, they have their presuppositions, they come to the discussion, and they tend to just assert their preconceived views, and most people are very reluctant to give way. And what's much more common than actually being persuaded and saying, you know what, you're right, what should we do in light of this new information? What they do is they just walk away from the discussion and then eventually change their mind months later. I'm guilty of this. I've done this with people. But why is that? Why do we act that way? It's obviously a factor of ego. We know that we don't have power. We know that our opportunities as a race, as individuals, are being taken away. Our opportunities are being taken away. And so we feel defeated. We feel down. And we look for ways of inflating ourselves, like calling the elites the bad guys, saying they're evil, and if I was in charge, it would be different. We want to feel superior. We find the smallest ways of feeling superior. Oh, you don't know this author, this obscure postmodern critic? Well, I know all about them. I know all about these guys who I've read about on Wikipedia. We find the shallowest ways to signal some kind of value because we want to feel valuable. And all of that is petty and beneath the kind of activity the elites engage in. Are you better than the elites? The sad thing is, it doesn't have to be like this. We could organize. We could get together and build something competitive. All the incentives are there. We could offer people something better than the kind of lifestyle they experience today. We know that. That's not debatable. The culture that people expose their kids to is toxic, and many parents know that, but there's just no alternative. When you turn on the streaming platforms, it's all an agenda. It's all pushing your children in a direction that's incompatible with the furtherance of the idea of your nation that your ancestors had. It's trying to strip you of all larger identity. And people don't like that. People want larger identity. We're in a position to offer that because we do have a comparative advantage in reading all of these fringe thinkers, de Maistre, Carlyle, whoever it is that gets you off. The perennialist authors, traditionalist authors, there's a lot of erudition actually in these communities, in an aspect of sociology that gets neglected in academic talk of sociology, which is basically just Marxist propaganda if you ever take a sociology course in college today. So we do have something to offer that people want. We have the product, but we're like a corporation that's just badly mismanaged, that cannot get anything done because there's no effective hierarchy, there's no accountability. What I've been trying to do is to organize in that way. But people tend to prefer to organize on the basis of friendship or charismatic leaders or some informal mechanism that has no inherent obligation, right? You don't want to sign up for duties. You want to feel the benefit of a larger identity and just watch a stream, maybe donate for a super chat. You know how it is. It's not productive. I've said for years that this is not a long-term strategy. It cannot work. And what can work is to organize in hierarchies intelligently. That's why I came up with the model of peer academy that I did. I've built the model. I know how to organize it. And I've also said, if anyone wants to talk to me about this, if you disagree with the model, have a conversation with me. I can't discuss everything in comments. No one has time for that. I will talk to anyone, though. My Skype is out there, but very few people reach out because we don't want to be challenged, because we don't want to get around to actually doing something about the information we have. We know what's happening. We know our opportunities are being taken away. We know our future does not look bright, but we're not interested in protecting the future because many of us have given up, but mostly we're afraid of challenging our ego. And apparently most people who disagree with me either think that I am worth dismissing because I'm so unintelligent or whatever, and I think that's obviously a cope. So people who disagree with me don't want to argue, even though I would argue publicly with anyone. I would debate anyone publicly who disagrees with my basic view of things. And then people who do agree. I have 40 people, roughly 30 people maybe, participating in the Plato group with me. And we're having a good time. We're reading through the dialogues, and that's a good thing. But, you could get into deeper discussions of what we ought to do collectively, but people have their own little idiosyncratic views, their own little biases, their own little, again, presuppositions about, well, this value is very important. In order to organize, ultimately, you need to have metaphysical consensus, and the average person is not capable of thinking about metaphysics. That's just how it is. Now, you might disagree that you need metaphysical consensus, but you can't know what the good is without metaphysics. That's definitional. Metaphysics is the science of essence. To know what the good is metaphysical knowledge. And without knowledge of the good, you can't have ethical knowledge. If you don't know the nature of goodness, how can you perceive the good? How can you go after the good collectively? In order to agree on ethical propositions, you need a common philosophy of ethics. In order to have ethics, you need to have some kind of cosmology, physics, anthropology, soteriology, and ultimately, you need a metaphysics and theology. But many people want to plug in their traditional metaphysics and theology, which is not up for debate, ultimately, because it brings in all sorts of presuppositions, biases, axioms that come from historical authors who are no longer alive that you cannot debate, right? If you cannot go against Thomas Aquinas, you can't argue with Thomas Aquinas. He's no longer living. And so the Thomistic dogmas of Catholicism, which are really in the process of changing since Vatican II. Anyway, but those dogmas are just there. An alternative metaphysical scheme is basically unthinkable. They will argue for their position, but there's no possibility of them listening to you, ultimately. There are many people like that who won't be budged. And in that case, rational cooperation is impossible. You cannot rationally cooperate with someone whose basic beliefs are axiomatic and unquestionable. You need that metaphysical consensus to have coherent ethical consensus and cooperation. So how do you build towards that? Well, you have discussions. Greatness, true greatness, power is actually within our grasp if we could organize. But to do that, you need to be of one mind. You need to have that philosophical consensus. And I will do it one-on-one with anyone in these spheres who has basically the same goal that I do, of establishing alternative communities that can survive what's happening, building alternative power structure, building alternative media, and not just the individual fame and monetization paradigm, but a new paradigm where we can produce things as good as Hollywood. Seems far-fetched, but it's not that expensive. If you get 100 people together, you can produce a really great work of art that can have a massive cultural impact. But you need to get those 100 people together, living in the same place, working day to day on a project. You can't do it remote. You need to actually build these things. We can achieve greatness if we can get that. But people are afraid to move. I've talked to several people who like the Pure Academy idea, but they don't want to move from where they are. Even though they don't own property where they are, there's nothing in particular that is keeping them there, except maybe their parents live nearby, something like that. But they talk to me and say, would you maybe want to start like a sister chapter of your organization where I am, which is basically them saying, I don't want to actually talk with you and arrive at fundamental consensus so that we can cooperate. I don't want to work under you. I want to be a leader of a community, but I also know that I can't organize one myself. So can you, even though you haven't succeeded in starting your first community, can you set aside resources and people to work in my area so that I can be the leader, so I can feel important? Ego cope. These people know who they are who are listening to this. And it's a selfish move. It's totally untenable. If that's how the average person acts, then nothing will be brought together. Some people have to sacrifice their individual comfort and where they are in life and move together into a common goal. So I talk to these sorts of people. In principle, if you got a group of people who accepted that we can come to rational consensus through discourse, and that will tell us what we ought to do at the end of the day. If you got 10 people like that in constant communication for a month, for 2 months, however long it takes, at the end of the day, assuming people aren't too stubborn to question their basic beliefs, you should have consensus. You should have a common plan. You should be able to build that. But the problem is people don't even show up for step one. Step one is getting together and discussing this stuff rationally. I already have a plan, the metaphysics. I've thought this stuff out. And that's my starting point. And I will listen to anyone who has criticisms, but people don't even show up for step one, which is talking it out and arriving at consensus. Even though my Skype is up there, 1,000 people on average watch these videos every time, including other content creators. I know that. People who have much larger followings watch my content, but people aren't interested in actually talking through this stuff. And it's not like these guys know what to do on their own independently. Like, what is your plan? How are you going to move forward here? Opportunities are drying up by the year exponentially, and the control of the elites over every aspect of our lives, including social media, is enhancing. That's not changing. There's a very limited window of time where we could set something up that would be truly revolutionary, that would be a massive benefit to people, that would give us power. But we're just too shy to talk. Whatever it is, I'm out there ready to talk. I'm ready to build this consensus and get something done. That's the attitude that the elites have. That's why the elites are powerful, because they got over their ego. They showed up and they defended their case. And ultimately they reached a consensus that is what allows them to operate today. It's not any particular technology. It's their networks. It's the fact that they were able to cooperate. That's why the elites are better than you, because they were willing to cooperate, whereas you are trapped in your own little solipsistic bubble. I don't know if that's true of your individual case, but many of you are caught in your habits, caught in your own concerns, preoccupations. You have no concept of the future beyond the next year, next 3 years. Maybe you have an idea of something, but too many of us fantasize about a future where we have power when we're not doing the things necessary to acquire power. Power comes from the ability to cooperate. We have to work together. We're a social species. That's how we gain power. So this is an option for you. You can be great. You can grow powerful and cooperate and discuss your differences and reach consensus. But as long as we are morally inferior to the elites, as long as we're more selfish and lazy than the elites will win and we will lose. Don't let that happen. Don't waste this opportunity. You will regret it for the rest of this life and for many lives to come. The opportunity is here now. But, there are many people who could talk this stuff out, people who have their own vision. Okay, talk to me. I've tried to reach out to people. Very few people want to talk it out, want to actually iron out these differences. And I'm saying it's coming from ego. It's not coming from their knowledge that they are infinitely superior to me and I'm not worth their time. The issue is ego. The issue is cope. The issue is a lack of discipline. And there's no excuse for that. Call me on Skype. Discuss these differences. If you think I'm wrong, tell me how. Tell me how. If you think my plan is wrong, tell me what a better plan is. But people don't think that way. They think in ways that are self-reinforcing, that allow them to feel superior to somebody. You're not superior to the elites. You're not superior to the people who are taking your opportunities away now. They showed up. They did the work. They cooperated. You are by yourself and you're powerless. Don't let that happen. Thank you for listening.